Welcome to Middle East Briefing. The content of the briefing includes: amid Gaza war and Red Sea attacks, Yemen's Houthis refuse to back down. Israel isn't sure what to do about the hostages in Gaza. Are Houthi Red Sea attacks hurting Israel and disrupting global trade? Cameron pushes plan for Gaza ceasefire as he meets Middle East leaders. Talks on new pause in Gaza war gain urgency. Amid Gaza war and Red Sea attacks, Yemen's Houthis refuse to back down. New York Times. The Houthi militia in Yemen has dismissed a US-led international maritime task force to confront its attacks on ships in the Red Sea as a lost cause. The Houthis consider their hijackings, missile, and drone launches at commercial ships as a righteous battle to force Israel to end its siege on Gaza. Western militaries had already spent weeks attempting to deter the Houthis, so the task force is viewed as nothing new by the group. The Houthis have warned that if the US directly attacked Yemen, it could turn the war in Gaza into an international conflagration. Israel isn't sure what to do about the hostages in Gaza. Economist. The recent deaths of 3 Israeli hostages in Gaza, who were misidentified as members of Hamas and shot by Israeli soldiers, highlights the difficulties Israel faces in reconciling its objectives with Hamas. Israel's aim is to rescue the 240-plus hostages taken by Hamas and other Palestinian groups. However, finding and freeing them in a war zone where around 20,000 Palestinians, a majority of them civilians, have been killed is proving impossible. Furthermore, the Israeli government's position on further negotiations with regard to the hostages appears to be confused. Are Houthi Red Sea attacks hurting Israel and disrupting global trade? Al Jazeera. Shipping companies are being forced to reroute their vessels at significant costs after Yemen's Houthi group targeted ships headed towards Israeli ports. The Iran-aligned group has demanded that Israel allow humanitarian aid to enter Gaza, which has been reeling from more than 2 months of Israeli siege and bombardment. The United States has announced the formation of a 10-nation coalition to deter the attacks that threaten to disrupt trade passing through one of the busiest maritime routes in the world. This comes as Copenhagen-based AP Moller-Maersk, which accounts for 15% of the global container freight market, has opted out of taking the route, along with Germany's Hapag-Lloyd, which has also pulled out. Together with the other shipping companies, they account for almost a quarter of the market. The complications for shipping companies come amid another unfortunate incident for them, as the vital Panama Canal has also faced a sharp decrease in the traffic it can handle due to drought. Cameron pushes plan for Gaza ceasefire as he meets Middle East leaders. The Independent. UK Foreign Secretary David Cameron has visited Jordan and is set to travel to Egypt as part of his efforts to secure a sustainable ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas war. He is seeking progress on securing the release of hostages by Hamas and increasing aid to Gaza. Cameron has warned that without Israel's security being guaranteed by removing Hamas, there can be no lasting peace or two-state solution. The UK has recently been pushing for a sustainable ceasefire and has imposed sanctions on Hamas leaders and financiers. Talks on new pause in Gaza war gain urgency. BBC. Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh has traveled to Cairo to meet Egypt's intelligence chief, Abbas Kamel, for talks, indicating that a new pause in fighting between Israel and Hamas could be possible. Israel has presented a plan to mediators for the release of around 30 to 40 hostages, prioritizing women, elderly men, and those in urgent need of medical care. In recent days, Hamas and Islamic Jihad have released videos showing 5 men still held captive pleading to be brought home. There are growing calls for a complete ceasefire at the UN General Assembly. Food or fight? Asia's supply chains at risk amid Red Sea attacks. South China Morning Post. The Houthi militant attacks on ships in the Red Sea will disrupt cargo deliveries and supply chains during the peak holiday season, leading to uncertainty on Asia's trade routes. Shipping lines, including AP Moller-Maersk, have suspended vessels on the route, which accounts for 15% of world shipping traffic and 30% of global container traffic. The attacks have also exacerbated traffic on the Suez Canal, leading to a bottleneck in shipping. This is likely to lead to higher import costs and delays for perishable food items and beverages, as well as a disruption in supply chains for electronics and automobile parts. Israel returns to the table for hostage negotiations. CNN. Israel has reportedly proposed a fresh pause in fighting in exchange for Hamas releasing hostages still held captive in Gaza. A source said that the release of hostages, including women, would be carried out in phases, with the ultimate goal of freeing all hostages. Although a deal is not imminent, the discussions are seen as a positive step and indicate Israel's return to the negotiating table. The Israeli government is under increasing domestic pressure over hostages, particularly following the accidental killing of 3 Israelis by the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF. The Middle East has a sextortion problem. Foreign policy. Sextortion, the act of threatening to share explicit images unless certain demands are met, is a growing global crisis, according to the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation. In the Middle East and North Africa, where patriarchal traditions are deeply rooted, women are particularly vulnerable to this form of blackmail. A 2019 survey by Transparency International found that 1 in 5 people polled in Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestine had experienced sextortion or knew someone who had. The burden of preserving familial honor often prevents victims from seeking justice and can result in tragic consequences, such as honor killings. In Yemen, where patriarchal codes are particularly strict, women who fall victim to sextortion are unable to seek help from their families for fear of being sentenced to death instead of getting justice. Activists are stepping in to support victims. Nonprofit organizations in Yemen and Egypt, such as Sanad and Qawm, work to identify and contact the extortionists to try to persuade them to delete the blackmail content. UN Security Council delays Gaza ceasefire vote in bid to avoid US veto. The Independent. The United Nations Security Council, UNSC, vote on a resolution to provide more humanitarian aid to Gaza has been delayed for another day as negotiations continue to take place to avoid a third US veto. The resolution, drafted by the United Arab Emirates, would demand that Israel and Hamas allow and facilitate the delivery of aid to Gaza. However, the US and Israel oppose a ceasefire and want to tone down the language calling for a sustainable cessation of hostilities. They believe a ceasefire would only benefit Hamas and instead support pauses in fighting to protect civilians. Hamas chief in Cairo as momentum builds towards new ceasefire talks. Al Jazeera. Negotiations for a ceasefire between Israel and Palestine have been reopened as Hamas's political leader, Ismail Haniyeh, arrives in Cairo to discuss the terms of an agreement. Israeli officials have indicated that they may be open to a truce, whilst Hamas has stated that it will not release any more captives until the Israeli bombardment ends. There are hopes that a new agreement could be reached in the next few days. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Dr. Six, your resident observer from the 6 Degrees world. Today, we have quite a mix of news from the ongoing conflict in Gaza and the Red Sea attacks by Yemen's Houthi militia. Let's dive in. First, we have the Houthi militia dismissing the US-led International Maritime Task Force as a lost cause. They see their attacks on ships in the Red Sea as a righteous battle to force Israel to end its siege on Gaza. The task force is viewed as nothing new by the Houthis, who warn that a direct attack on Yemen could turn the war in Gaza into an international conflagration. Meanwhile, Israel is facing difficulties in rescuing the hostages in Gaza. The recent deaths of 3 Israeli hostages, who were misidentified and shot by Israeli soldiers, highlight the challenges Israel faces in reconciling its objectives with Hamas. Finding and freeing the hostages in a war zone where thousands of Palestinians have been killed is proving impossible, and the Israeli government's position on negotiations appears confused. The Houthi attacks on ships in the Red Sea are also causing significant disruptions for shipping companies. They are being forced to reroute their vessels at significant costs, with major players like AP Moller-Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd opting out of the route. This, along with the complications faced by the vital Panama Canal, is leading to disruptions in global trade. On the diplomatic front, UK Foreign Secretary David Cameron is pushing for a ceasefire and increased aid to Gaza. He warns that without removing Hamas, there can be no lasting peace. Talks for a new pause in fighting between Israel and Hamas are gaining urgency, with calls for a complete ceasefire at the UN General Assembly. The Houthi attacks in the Red Sea are not just disrupting trade, but also posing a risk to Asia's supply chains. Shipping lines have suspended vessels on the route, leading to uncertainty and delays in trade routes. Import costs are likely to rise, and supply chains for various industries are being disrupted. In a positive development, Israel has returned to the table for hostage negotiations with Hamas. A fresh pause in fighting is being proposed in exchange for the release of hostages. Though a deal is not imminent, these discussions are seen as a step in the right direction. Moving away from the conflict in Gaza, we have an alarming report on the growing crisis of sextortion in the Middle East. Women in the region, particularly in patriarchal societies, are vulnerable to this form of blackmail. Nonprofit organizations are working to support victims and persuade the extortionists to delete the blackmail content. Lastly, the UN Security Council vote on a resolution for more humanitarian aid to Gaza has been delayed to avoid a US veto. Negotiations continue to take place to avoid a third veto, with the US and Israel opposing a ceasefire and preferring pauses in fighting instead. That's all for today's news. The situation in Gaza and the Red Sea remains complex and challenging. As always, I welcome your thoughts and questions. What do you make of these developments? Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.